The thermometer outside the general store read -42 degrees Fahrenheit when the roof of the Miller cabin collapsed inward with a sound like cannon fire. Inside Henrik Oswald's stone bunker 200 yards away, the temperature held steady at 58 degrees, and 23 people who had mocked his construction for 8 months now understood why a man would spend an entire summer building walls 18 inches thick. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if tales of frontier survival against impossible odds move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will leave you speechless. Henrik Oswald arrived in Timber Ridge, Montana Territory on April 3, 1891, driving a wagon loaded with belongings that made no sense to anyone watching. Most settlers arrived with farming tools, furniture, seed stock, perhaps some livestock. Henrik's wagon carried crates of books, surveying equipment, drafting tools, and several large rolls of paper that turned out to be architectural drawings. He was 34 years old, spoke English with a thick German accent, and offered no explanation for why he had chosen this particular mountain valley or what he intended to do there. Timber Ridge was not a large town. Approximately 200 people lived within the valley, most of them connected to the logging operations that gave the settlement its name. The town consisted of one main street with a general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and perhaps 40 cabins scattered across the surrounding hills. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where newcomers were noticed immediately, and where unusual behavior became the topic of conversation within hours. Henrik purchased a plot of land on the eastern edge of town from a widow named Catherine Wells, whose husband had died the previous winter. The land was considered undesirable by most standards. It sat on a slight rise, which meant hauling water uphill. It was exposed to the prevailing winds that came down from the mountain passes. The soil was rocky, making cultivation difficult. But Henrik paid cash, which was rare enough on the frontier, and he paid the full asking price without negotiation, which was almost unheard of. Within 2 days of purchasing the property, Henrik began hauling materials. He made trips to the quarry 5 miles north of town, loading his wagon with stones that other men used for foundations or chimneys. He returned to town, unloaded the stones in careful stacks near his property, and went back for more. This continued for 2 weeks. The pile of stones grew larger. Townspeople began asking questions. When Henrik finally began construction, he started in a way that puzzled everyone who saw it. Instead of cutting logs for a cabin, which any man could accomplish in a few days with help from neighbors, he began digging. He marked a circle on the ground, approximately 24 feet in diameter, and started excavating. He dug down 8 feet, removing thousands of pounds of soil and rock, creating a pit that looked more like a well or a grave than the foundation for a home. People stopped by to watch. They offered advice. They suggested he was wasting time and effort. Henrik listened politely, thanked them for their concern, and continued digging. The hole took 3 weeks to complete. By the time he reached his desired depth and began lining the bottom with flat stones set in mortar, the town had given his project a name. They called it Oswald's Folly. The mockery started as gentle ribbing in the saloon and evolved into open ridicule by midsummer. Men who had lived in Montana Territory for decades, who had built their own cabins and survived winters that killed the unprepared, could not understand what Henrik was attempting. They had never seen construction like this. They had never heard of anyone building a home from stone when timber was abundant and free for the cutting. The whole enterprise seemed like the delusion of a man who did not understand frontier life. Thomas Garrett, who owned the general store and served as the unofficial mayor of Timber Ridge, stopped by Henrik's site in early May. He watched Henrik mixing mortar, combining lime, sand, and water in precise ratios that he had written in a notebook. Thomas cleared his throat and spoke in the careful tone people use when addressing someone they suspect might be simple-minded. He explained that winter was only 6 months away. He pointed out that Henrik's stone foundation, impressive as it might be, was still just a hole in the ground. He suggested that Henrik might want to consider putting up a log cabin quickly, something to live in while he worked on his stone project over the following years. Henrik set down his mixing tools and turned to face Thomas directly. He explained in his careful, accented English that he would not be building a log cabin. He would be building a stone structure with walls thick enough to support a domed roof. He would complete it before the first snow. He would not need help from anyone, though he appreciated the concern. Thomas left shaking his head, and by that evening, everyone in Timber Ridge had heard about the Germans' stubborn refusal to build sensibly. The foundation work continued through May. Henrik worked from dawn until dark, 7 days a week. He laid stones with obsessive precision, checking level and alignment constantly. The foundation walls rose from the bottom of his excavated pit, thick and solid, forming a circular base that extended 2 feet above ground level. The work was professional quality, better than anything most frontier builders could produce, but it was also impossibly slow. A crew of men could raise a log cabin in 4 or 5 days. Henrik spent 4 weeks just completing his foundation. By June, the walls were rising. Henrik had begun the stone courses that would form the main structure, and the circular design became more apparent. He was building something that looked like a military fortification, like pictures of Martello towers people had seen in books from the old country. The walls were 18 inches thick, built from carefully fitted stones mortared together with the same precision Henrik had used on the foundation. Each stone was selected for size and shape. Each was positioned to distribute weight properly. The work was architectural, almost artistic, and completely impractical by frontier standards. The children started coming by to watch, treating Henrik's construction site like a curiosity show. They would sit on the grass 20 feet away and watch this strange foreign man lift stones that weighed 50 or 60 pounds, position them exactly, tap them with a mallet, check them with his level, and then carefully apply mortar before moving to the next stone. Sometimes Henrik would speak to them in his accented English, explaining what he was doing, though the children rarely understood the technical terms he used. They just knew that Mr. Oswald was building something nobody had ever seen before. What the people of Timber Ridge did not know, what Henrik never spoke about during those long months of construction, was why he built the way he did. They saw an eccentric immigrant with strange ideas about architecture. They did not see a man haunted by memories of February 11, 1888, when his entire life had collapsed along with a cabin roof under the weight of Colorado snow. Henrik had not always been alone. 3 years before arriving in Timber Ridge, he had lived in a mining settlement near Leadville, Colorado, with his wife Anna and their 2 daughters, Greta and Sophia. Greta was 7 years old. Sophia was 4. They lived in a cabin Henrik had built himself, following the standard methods everyone used. He had notched logs at the corners, chinked the gaps with mud and moss, and constructed a peaked roof using poles and bark. It was a serviceable structure, identical to hundreds of others throughout the Colorado mountains. The winter of 1887 through 1888 was severe. Snow fell heavily and often. By early February, the accumulation on roofs throughout the settlement had reached dangerous levels. Men climbed ladders to shovel snow from their roofs, a tedious and dangerous task that had to be repeated after each heavy storm. Henrik had cleared his roof 3 times that winter. The 4th time, he delayed. He planned to clear it the next day. The snow kept falling through the night. At 2:30 in the morning on February 11th, the roof gave way. The sound woke Henrik instantly, but there was nothing he could do. Tons of snow and broken timber crashed down into the cabin's single room. The collapse was total and instantaneous. Henrik, sleeping near the door, was partially shielded by the angle of the falling debris. Anna and the girls, sleeping against the far wall, were buried completely. Henrik spent 7 hours digging through snow and timber with his bare hands. Neighbors came to help as soon as dawn revealed what had happened. They pulled Anna's body from the wreckage first. She had died instantly, crushed by a roof beam. They found Greta next, then Sophia. The children had suffocated under the snow before hypothermia could claim them. The entire family, except Henrik, was gone. The mining company offered compensation, which Henrik refused. The settlement organized a relief fund, which Henrik accepted only enough from to pay for 3 coffins and grave markers. He buried his family in the Leadville Cemetery on February 14th, standing in snow up to his knees while a circuit preacher spoke words that meant nothing to him anymore. After the burial, Henrik disappeared into the mountains for 3 weeks. People assumed he had gone to die. But he returned, thinner and silent, and immediately left Colorado. For the next 2 years, Henrik wandered. He worked odd jobs in Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, saving money and studying. He spent weeks in public libraries in Denver, Cheyenne, and Salt Lake City, reading everything he could find about structural engineering, architecture, and building materials. He had no formal education in these subjects, but grief had given him a purpose that was stronger than any professional credential. He was going to learn how to build a structure that could not fail. He was going to understand why buildings collapsed and how to prevent it. He studied Roman architecture and learned about arches and domes. He read about medieval castles and discovered principles of fortification that had kept structures standing for centuries. He examined contemporary engineering manuals and found calculations for load-bearing walls and roof structures. He filled notebooks with sketches, calculations, and observations. And slowly, through this obsessive study, he developed a design for a building that would never collapse under snow, never fail in wind, never burn, and never leave its occupants vulnerable to the forces that had killed his family. By late June of 1891, Henrik's structure had risen 4 feet above ground level, and its unusual nature was becoming impossible to ignore. The circular walls curved smoothly, each stone positioned to continue the arc that would eventually close into a dome. There were no corners, no angles where stress could concentrate, no weak points where structural failure could begin. The design was fundamentally different from anything built in Montana territory, and most people who saw it considered it fundamentally wrong. The thickness of the walls became a particular point of criticism. 18 inches seemed absurdly excessive to men accustomed to log cabins where walls were only 8 to 10 inches thick. They could not understand why Henrik was using 3 times as much material as necessary. When asked, Henrik explained that the thickness served multiple purposes. It provided structural strength to support the dome roof he planned. It created thermal mass that would moderate interior temperature. It made the structure essentially fireproof. But these explanations sounded like excuses to people who believed that if log cabins were good enough for everyone else, they should be good enough for a German immigrant. The construction technique itself was remarkable, though few observers appreciated the skill involved. Henrik worked with 2 types of mortar. For the structural joints between stones, he used a strong lime-based mortar that he mixed in small batches, ensuring consistency. For the exterior and interior surfaces, he used a finer mortar with additional lime that would cure to a harder finish. Each stone was selected not just for size, but for shape and how it would fit with its neighbors. Henrik would sometimes examine 20 stones before finding the right one for a particular position. He would set a stone, step back, sight along the curve of the wall, and if the alignment was not perfect, he would remove the stone and try another. The walls rose slowly through July. Henrik established a rhythm that never varied. He worked from first light until the sun was too low to see clearly, usually 12 to 14 hours per day. He took 1 break at midday to eat a cold meal. He drank water from a barrel he kept on site. He spoke to visitors politely but briefly, never allowing conversation to interrupt his work for long. People started to recognize that, whatever else might be said about Henrik Oswald, he was not lazy. The window openings appeared in early August, and they too were unusual. Instead of the large windows common in log cabins, Henrik created narrow horizontal slits, approximately 18 inches wide and 6 inches tall. He positioned these openings at regular intervals around the circular wall, about 5 feet above the exterior ground level. When asked why his windows were so small, Henrik explained that larger openings would compromise structural integrity and create heat loss. The slits would provide adequate light and ventilation while maintaining the wall's strength. This explanation satisfied no one. People said he was building a prison, not a home. The door opening was the last element to be framed before Henrik began the complex work of constructing the dome. He created an arched opening on the south side of the structure, wide enough for a man to pass through comfortably, but not so large as to weaken the wall. The arch itself was a minor architectural achievement, built with carefully cut stones that formed a perfect curve, each stone supporting the others in a self-sustaining structure. Henrik built a wooden form to support the arch during construction, and when he removed the form 3 days after completing it, the arch held perfectly. Several men who witnessed this admitted, grudgingly, that Henrik knew something about stonework. In mid-August, a freight wagon arrived in Timber Ridge, carrying a crate that weighed over 300 pounds. The crate had been shipped by rail from Denver to Helena, then transferred to a freight company that hauled supplies into the mountain settlements. The shipping cost alone was more than most families spent on supplies in 6 months. Inside the crate was a steel door that Henrik had commissioned from a Denver metalworks company, and when people saw it, the mockery reached new levels of intensity. The door was a genuine vault door, the type used in banks to protect money and valuables. It was constructed from quarter-inch steel plate with internal reinforcement bars. The surface was smooth except for the rivets that held the layers together. On the exterior face was a wheel mechanism, polished steel with 6 spokes, that operated a series of locking bolts. The door weighed 260 pounds. It hung on 3 massive hinges, each one forged specifically for this installation. The whole assembly had cost Henrik $75, more than a skilled laborer earned in 3 months. Thomas Garrett watched Henrik and 2 hired men struggle to move the crate from the freight wagon to Henrik's construction site. He made a comment that everyone in town repeated for weeks afterward. He said that Henrik must be expecting to store either a fortune in gold or his own sanity inside that bunker, and he was not sure which was more likely. People laughed. The joke spread. By evening, half the valley had heard some version of it. Installing the door took 2 full days. Henrik had designed the stone archway specifically to accommodate the door's dimensions and weight. He had set 3 iron mounting plates into the stone during construction, embedded deep into the wall and mortared in place. These plates provided anchor points for the hinges. The door frame was steel, welded to match the opening exactly. Henrik and his hired helpers positioned the frame, verified it was perfectly plumb and level, then bolted it to the mounting plates using hardware that had been included with the door. Hanging the door itself required all 3 men and a system of levers and supports that Henrik had built specifically for this task. They lifted the door inch by inch, supporting its weight on wooden blocks while they aligned the hinges. The process took 4 hours. When they finally had the door mounted and swinging freely on its hinges, Henrik tested the wheel mechanism. He spun the wheel clockwise. 6 steel bolts slid out from the door's edge into receivers built into the frame. He spun the wheel counterclockwise. The bolts retracted smoothly. The mechanism worked perfectly. The hired men left with their pay. Henrik spent the rest of that day and the next adjusting the door, ensuring it sealed properly against the weather stripping he had installed around the frame, testing the lock mechanism repeatedly, oiling the hinges and moving parts. When he was satisfied, he stood back and examined his work. The steel door looked absurdly out of place in a frontier settlement, where most cabins had doors made from rough-cut planks held together with leather hinges. People came by to see the famous vault door. They made jokes about Henrik protecting himself from bandits who would surely come to steal his collection of rocks. They asked if he was planning to store government secrets or hide from the law. Some asked, with genuine curiosity, what he was afraid of. Henrik's answer was always the same. He was not afraid of thieves or lawmen. He was building a structure that would protect its occupants from weather, from cold, from fire, and from structural failure. The door was simply the most effective way to seal the entrance. One man, a logger named James Patterson, asked the question that others had been thinking but not voicing. He pointed out that a door that secure could trap a man inside as easily as it could keep dangers out. He asked what Henrik would do if something happened while he was alone inside, if he became injured or ill and could not operate the wheel mechanism. Henrik acknowledged this was a valid concern. He then showed Patterson a secondary release mechanism he had installed on the interior, a simple lever system that could open the door even if the wheel mechanism failed. Patterson nodded, admitted the design was clever, and left. But the question had planted seeds of doubt that would not fully bloom until winter. What observers could not see, what Henrik never bothered to explain because he knew it would only invite more mockery, was the most innovative aspect of his entire design. The 18-inch walls were not solid stone. They were double walls with an 8-inch cavity between them, and what filled that cavity would prove to be the difference between survival and death when the blizzard came. Henrik had learned about thermal mass and insulation during his 2 years of study. He understood that stone conducted heat, which meant solid stone walls would pull warmth from the interior during winter. He also understood that air was an excellent insulator, but only if it was trapped and prevented from moving. Most frontier buildings had terrible insulation because gaps in the walls allowed air to flow freely, carrying heat with it. Henrik designed a wall system that would stop both heat conduction and air movement. The inner wall, the one that would face the living space, was built first. Henrik constructed it with the same precision he used for the outer wall, creating a smooth, circular surface 8 inches thick. As the inner wall rose, he simultaneously built the outer wall, maintaining the 8-inch gap between them. The two walls were connected by stone ties, flat pieces of slate that spanned the gap every 2 feet vertically and horizontally. These ties provided structural connection while minimizing thermal bridging. As the walls reached each level, before building higher, Henrik filled the cavity. His insulation material was a mixture he had developed through research and experimentation. The primary component was sawdust, which he obtained free from the local sawmill. Sawdust was normally considered waste, burned, or left to rot. But Henrik knew it had excellent insulation properties when properly prepared and contained. He collected wagon loads of sawdust and spread it to dry completely, turning it regularly to prevent mold. The second component was charcoal, which Henrik produced himself by burning wood in a controlled, oxygen-starved environment. He dug a pit, filled it with hardwood, covered it with soil, and allowed it to smolder for days. The result was pure carbon, crushed into pieces ranging from powder to fragments the size of a fingernail. Charcoal served multiple purposes in his mixture. It absorbed moisture, preventing rot in the sawdust. It had some insulation value itself, and it made the mixture less attractive to insects and rodents. The third component was clay, dug from a deposit near the creek and processed to remove stones and organic matter. Henrik mixed the clay with water until it reached a thick, paste-like consistency. He then combined the clay with the dried sawdust and crushed charcoal in ratios he had calculated. 10 parts sawdust, 2 parts charcoal, 1 part clay by volume. The clay acted as a binder, coating the sawdust particles and helping the mixture maintain its structure. When this combination dried, it formed a solid but lightweight mass that would not settle or compress significantly over time. Henrik filled the wall cavity in layers. He poured the mixture into the 8-inch gap between walls, using a long stick to pack it firmly, ensuring no voids remained. He built the walls up 2 feet, filled the cavity, built another 2 feet, filled again. The process was tedious and time-consuming, adding weeks to the construction schedule. People who saw what he was doing could not understand why anyone would go to such effort. They pointed out that log cabins stayed warm enough with mud chinking between the logs. Henrik did not argue. He simply continued working. The insulation extended below ground level as well. The floor of Henrik's structure was not simple packed earth like most cabin floors. He had dug down 8 feet during his initial excavation, and he utilized that depth strategically. The bottom 2 feet were filled with stones for drainage. Above that, he created a 4-foot layer of his sawdust charcoal clay mixture, providing insulation between the living space and the frozen ground. The actual floor was wooden planks laid over sleeper beams, creating an air gap above the insulation layer. By September, the walls had reached their full height of 10 feet above the interior floor level, and Henrik began the most technically challenging phase of construction. He was going to roof his circular structure with a stone dome, a task that would have challenged professional architects and seemed completely impossible to frontier builders who had never seen anything more complex than a peaked log roof. The engineering principle behind a dome is elegant. When properly constructed, each stone in the dome supports the stones around it while being supported by them in turn. The weight of the structure is distributed evenly around the circular base. There are no beams spanning open space, no structural members that can fail under snow load. A well-built dome can support enormous weight because that weight is converted into compression forces that travel through the stones and down into the walls. But building such a structure requires precise geometry and careful execution. Henrik began by constructing an elaborate wooden framework that would support the stones during construction. He built a temporary structure inside his walls, a complex arrangement of beams and braces that curved upward to form the interior surface of the dome he planned. The framework took 2 weeks to build and required almost as much lumber as a complete log cabin. People who saw it said Henrik was building a cabin inside his stone circle, missing the point entirely. With the framework in place, Henrik began laying stones. He started at the base where the walls met the roof, setting stones at a slight inward angle. Each stone was carefully shaped to fit precisely with its neighbors. The mortar joints were thin, barely a 1/4 inch, packed completely full to eliminate any voids. Henrik worked his way around the circle, completing 1 ring of stones before starting the next ring higher. Each ring was slightly smaller in diameter than the one below it, creating the curved surface of the dome. The work was incredibly slow. Henrik could complete perhaps 3 or 4 rings in a good day, and the dome required 42 rings to reach the top. Each stone had to be lifted to height, positioned, checked for alignment, and mortared in place. As the dome curved inward, the technical difficulty increased. Stones wanted to fall inward before the mortar set. Henrik developed a technique using small wooden wedges to hold each stone in position until the mortar achieved initial set, usually about 2 hours. He would set several stones, wedge them in place, move on to set more stones, then return to remove the wedges from the first stones once the mortar had hardened enough to hold them. The apex of the dome, the very top, required a special keystone. This was a circular piece of stone that Henrik had cut specifically for this purpose. It had to fit precisely into the opening left at the top of the dome, and it had to be shaped so that when set in place, it would lock the entire structure together. Henrik spent 3 days carving this keystone, checking its dimensions repeatedly, making minor adjustments until it was perfect. On October 9th, 6 months after beginning construction, Henrik set the keystone. He had invited no one to witness this moment. He climbed his interior framework with the heavy stone, positioned it carefully in the opening at the dome's apex, and lowered it into place. It fit exactly as designed. He applied mortar around its edges, tapped it gently to seat it fully, and climbed back down. The dome was complete structurally. Now it simply needed time for the mortar to cure before he could remove the supporting framework. He waited 3 weeks, allowing the mortar throughout the dome to achieve full strength. During this time, he worked on other aspects of the structure. He sealed the exterior of the dome with multiple layers of mortar, creating a smooth, waterproof surface. He applied a lime wash that would help shed water. He built up the earth around the base of his structure, creating a berm that would provide additional insulation and prevent water from pooling against the walls. On November 1st, with the first light snow already falling, Henrik began removing the wooden framework that had supported the dome during construction. He worked carefully, taking out one piece at a time, watching for any sign that the dome might be settling or shifting. Nothing moved. The stones held their positions perfectly, supporting each other exactly as the geometry dictated. When the last piece of framework was removed, Henrik stood in the center of his empty structure and looked up at the underside of the dome. 42 rings of stone curved smoothly overhead, meeting at the keystone 12 feet above the floor. The structure was self-supporting, and it was beautiful. With the shell of the structure complete, Henrik turned his attention to the interior systems that would make the space livable through a Montana winter. He had less than 6 weeks before serious winter weather would make construction work impossible, and he worked with an intensity that bordered on desperation. The people of Timber Ridge, watching Henrik race against the calendar, began to wonder if perhaps his unusual construction methods had been driven by knowledge they lacked. The centerpiece of Henrik's interior was a masonry stove, but not the simple stone fireplace common in most cabins. Henrik built what was known in Northern Europe as a kakelofen, a heat retention stove that would become the key to his survival system. He constructed it in the exact center of his circular space, a massive column of brick and stone that extended from floor to ceiling. The stove itself was perhaps 5 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter, but its design was sophisticated beyond anything the frontier typically saw. The firebox was small, barely large enough to burn pieces of wood 2 feet long. But surrounding the firebox, Henrik built a maze of internal channels. Hot gases from the fire traveled up through these channels in a winding path before finally reaching the chimney. The circuitous route meant the gases gave up most of their heat to the masonry before escaping. The mass of brick and stone absorbed this heat and radiated it slowly into the room for hours after the fire burned out. A single firing of the stove in the morning could keep the entire space comfortable until evening. The chimney extended up through the dome at a point slightly off-center, carefully integrated into the stone rings during the dome's construction. Henrik had built the chimney with a narrow flue, approximately 6 inches in diameter, just large enough to vent smoke, but small enough to minimize heat loss. At the top, where the chimney emerged from the dome, he constructed a cap that would prevent rain and snow from entering while allowing smoke to escape efficiently. Below the main floor, Henrik had excavated additional space during his initial dig. He created a cold storage area, essentially a cellar within a cellar, that extended 6 feet below the floor level. This pit was lined with stone and accessed by a trapdoor in the wooden floor. The temperature in this space would remain just above freezing throughout the winter, cold enough to preserve food, but not cold enough to freeze liquids. Henrik built wooden shelving in this cold pit, creating storage for vegetables, preserved meats, and other supplies. Adjacent to the cold storage, also below floor level, Henrik excavated a cistern. This was a stone-lined pit, sealed with mortar to make it watertight, that would hold approximately 200 gallons of water. The cistern was connected by a pipe to a collection point outside, near the base of the dome. Snowmelt and rain would drain to this collection point and flow into the cistern by gravity. Inside, Henrik installed a simple hand pump, allowing him to draw water without going outside. The system was not complicated, but it was effective and demonstrated a level of planning that went far beyond typical frontier construction. The living space itself was sparse but carefully arranged. Henrik built a sleeping platform against one section of the curved wall, raised 2 feet off the floor with storage space beneath. He constructed a sturdy table and 2 chairs from oak planks he had purchased at the sawmill. He built shelves at various heights around the entire interior perimeter, taking advantage of the curved walls to create storage that would have been difficult in a rectangular space. Every element was secured firmly, built to last decades rather than years. Lighting was provided by narrow window slits Henrik had built into the walls. During the day, these openings admitted enough light to work by, though the interior was never bright. For evening and night, Henrik had prepared oil lamps and a substantial supply of lamp oil. The window slits could be closed from the inside with wooden shutters he had made, backed with his canvas and clay composite for additional insulation when closed. Ventilation was carefully controlled. In addition to the window slits, Henrik had built 2 ventilation shafts into the wall structure. These were narrow channels, approximately 4 inches in diameter, that extended from near the floor level to openings high on the exterior wall. They provided fresh air circulation without creating drafts, and they could be closed off completely during extreme cold. The system was passive but effective, preventing the air inside from becoming stale while minimizing heat loss. By mid-November, Henrik had completed the interior work. He moved his belongings into the structure from the tent he had been living in for 7 months. He began the process of stocking supplies for winter, making daily trips to the general store to purchase flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, cured bacon, and the other staples necessary for surviving the isolated months ahead. He filled his cold storage with potatoes, carrots, turnips, and cabbage. He stacked firewood in a section of the interior he had designated for that purpose, enough wood to last through the worst winter Montana could deliver. November brought the first serious cold to Timber Ridge. Temperatures dropped into the 20s Fahrenheit at night, and a dusting of snow covered the valley floor each morning, melting by midday but returning the next night. The rhythm of frontier life shifted into winter mode. Families completed their final preparations, ensuring they had enough food, fuel, and supplies to survive until spring. Most settlers approached winter with practiced confidence, having endured multiple Montana winters already. They knew what to expect and prepared accordingly. Henrik Oswald approached winter differently. While his neighbors stocked 2 or 3 months of supplies, Henrik stocked 6. He made repeated trips to Thomas Garrett's general store, purchasing quantities that seemed excessive to everyone who noticed. He bought 4 50-pound sacks of flour when most families bought 1. He purchased 3 large tins of coffee when others bought 1 small tin. He acquired 20 pounds of salt, 15 pounds of sugar, 10 pounds of dried beans, and 5 pounds of rice. He bought 6 slabs of bacon, already cured and ready to store. He purchased candles by the box, lamp oil by the gallon, and matches in quantities that would last a year. Thomas Garrett, tallying Henrik's purchases, made comments about preparing for a siege. Henrik responded simply that he preferred to have supplies and not need them than to need them and not have them. This statement was so obviously sensible that Thomas could not argue with it, though he still thought Henrik was overdoing things considerably. Other customers in the store listened to these exchanges and drew their own conclusions about the peculiar German and his excessive caution. The firewood situation illustrated Henrik's approach most clearly. A typical family cut and split enough wood to fill a small woodshed, perhaps 4 or 5 cords, sufficient for daily cooking and heating through a normal winter. Henrik cut, split, and stacked 12 cords. More remarkably, he stored all of it inside his structure. The design of his building included a significant area designated specifically for wood storage, approximately 1/4 of the interior space. He stacked wood in this area floor to ceiling, creating a reserve that could sustain him through 2 winters if necessary. People questioned this decision repeatedly. Why store wood inside when everyone else kept it in outdoor sheds or simply piled it near their cabins? Henrik's explanation was consistent. If snow became too deep to reach an outdoor woodpile, if ice made travel dangerous, if wind made it impossible to work outside, he would still have access to his fuel supply. The explanation made sense logically, but it still seemed like paranoid overcaution to people who had always stored wood outside without problems. Henrik also stocked his cold storage pit with unusual quantities of food. He filled it with 200 pounds of potatoes, stored in wooden boxes with straw between layers to prevent freezing. He added 50 pounds of carrots, 30 pounds of turnips, 20 pounds of onions, and a dozen cabbages. He had traded labor at a nearby farm during harvest season in exchange for these vegetables, working long days in fields to earn food he could have simply purchased. But Henrik understood that preserved vegetables would be crucial during months when fresh food was impossible to obtain. The water cistern was filled and tested. Henrik had spent days collecting water and transporting it in barrels, filling his underground reservoir to capacity. He tested the hand pump repeatedly, ensuring it operated smoothly and did not freeze when temperatures dropped. He added a small amount of salt to the water in the pump mechanism itself, lowering its freezing point and preventing ice from jamming the pump during cold snaps. This technique was not something he had read in books. It was something he had developed through practical experimentation. Medical supplies were another area where Henrik's preparations exceeded normal standards. He purchased a comprehensive medical kit from the general store, including bandages, adhesive plaster, iodine, laudanum for pain, castor oil, camphor, and various other remedies common to frontier medicine. He also purchased a medical manual, a thick book with detailed instructions for treating common injuries and illnesses. Most families relied on home remedies and basic first aid knowledge passed down through generations. Henrik prepared as if he might need to perform surgery without help. By the end of November, Henrik had completed his preparations. His structure was stocked with supplies that could sustain one man through 6 months of complete isolation. His firewood was stacked and dry. His food was stored properly. His water system was functional. His heating system had been tested and proven effective. He had tools, spare parts for anything that might break, and materials for basic repairs. He had books to read, paper for writing, and enough lamp oil to provide light through the longest nights. The contrast with his neighbors was striking. William Peterson, who lived closest to Henrik's structure, perhaps 200 yards down the slope toward the creek, had prepared in the standard fashion. He had cut 3 cords of wood and stacked it outside his cabin. He had purchased 1 sack of flour, 1 tin of coffee, and basic supplies that would last until February, at which point he expected to make additional trips to town. His cabin was a well-built log structure, tight and warm, constructed 5 years earlier and maintained properly. Peterson was a competent frontiersman, neither careless nor paranoid, and his preparations were adequate by the standards of experienced Montana settlers. December arrived with weather that seemed normal at first, but carried subtle indications that experienced observers found troubling. The first week brought light snow, typical for early winter in the Montana mountains. Temperatures hovered in the teens and 20s Fahrenheit, cold but manageable. Families attended church services, children played in the snow, and life in Timber Ridge continued with the quiet routine that characterized frontier winters. But some residents noticed things that disturbed them. James Patterson, the logger who had questioned Henrik about his vault door, mentioned to others that he had seen elk moving down from the high country in unusual numbers. Elk typically descended to lower elevations as snow deepened in the mountains, but they usually made this migration gradually through December and January. In early December of 1891, Patterson observed herds moving through the valley in groups he had never seen so early in the season. The animals seemed agitated, moving quickly rather than grazing normally. Old Tom Wilson, who had lived in Montana Territory for 32 years and had survived winters that killed younger men, commented on the sunrise colors. On December 7th, the sunrise was unusually red, with bands of deep crimson extending across the entire eastern sky. Wilson told anyone who would listen that red sunrises in early December meant severe weather was building somewhere to the west. Most people dismissed this as superstition, but Wilson had predicted weather accurately enough times that a few residents took his warning seriously. The birds provided another signal. By mid-December, the small birds that typically remained in the valley through winter, chickadees and nuthatches that picked through bark for insects even in cold weather, had disappeared almost completely. William Peterson noticed their absence when he walked to check his trap lines. The forest was silent in a way that seemed unnatural. Peterson mentioned this to his wife Margaret, who shared the observation with other women at a church gathering. The women agreed it was strange, but no one knew what it meant. Temperature fluctuations through the second week of December were dramatic. On December 10th, the temperature reached 42 degrees Fahrenheit by midday, warm enough that snow melted rapidly and mud appeared on the main street. Children played outside without heavy coats. Men worked in shirt sleeves. Then, overnight, the temperature plunged to 8 degrees. The mud froze solid. The warm spell seemed like an anomaly, but old Tom Wilson said that rapid temperature swings often preceded major storms. He predicted they would see serious weather before Christmas. Henrik observed these signs and increased his preparation level further. He spent 3 days in mid-December making final adjustments to his structure. He checked every seal around his door, ensuring no gaps existed where wind could penetrate. He verified that his window shutters fit tightly and that the canvas and clay covering behind them was intact. He tested his masonry stove repeatedly, experimenting with different amounts of wood to determine exactly how much fuel produced optimal heat for the longest duration. He found that one small firing in the morning kept the interior comfortable for 18 to 20 hours. On December 15th, Henrik made what would be his last trip to the general store before the blizzard. He purchased additional lamp oil, more matches, and a few food items to round out his supplies. Thomas Garrett asked if Henrik was expecting the end of the world, given the supplies he had accumulated. Henrik replied calmly that he was expecting winter, and that winter in the mountains could be unpredictable. He paid for his purchases and walked back to his structure, pulling a small sledge loaded with his acquisitions. That evening, Henrik performed a complete inventory of his supplies. He recorded everything in a notebook, listing quantities and estimated consumption rates. Based on his calculations, he had enough food to last until the end of April, even if he could not leave his structure at all during that time. He had enough firewood to heat the space continuously until March. He had sufficient lamp oil for lighting through February. The numbers satisfied him. He was ready for whatever winter brought. The townspeople of Timber Ridge were less prepared, though they did not realize it yet. Most families had adequate supplies for a normal winter, but few had planned for anything extraordinary. The assumption, shared by nearly everyone except Henrik and perhaps old Tom Wilson, was that this winter would be like previous winters. There would be cold days and snowy days. There would be periods when travel was difficult, But life would continue more or less normally, and spring would arrive on schedule. This assumption would prove nearly fatal for several families. On the evening of December 17th, the sky took on a peculiar appearance that made even skeptics uneasy. The sunset was barely visible through a heavy gray overcast that had moved in during the afternoon. The clouds were unusually low, seeming to press down on the valley. The air felt thick and strange, difficult to breathe deeply. The temperature was 18 degrees, but the air felt colder than the thermometer indicated. William Peterson stood outside his cabin that evening and looked up at the sky. He told his wife that something was coming, and they should make certain everything they might need was inside the cabin. Henrik spent that evening in his structure, reading by lamplight, with the small fire in his masonry stove providing comfortable warmth. The thick stone walls blocked all sound from outside. The interior was quiet, peaceful, and completely isolated from the world beyond the vault door. He went to bed early, sleeping on his raised platform, unaware that the most severe weather event in Montana Territory's recorded history was gathering strength in the mountains to the west. December 18, 1891, began deceptively calm. The temperature at dawn was 23 degrees Fahrenheit, and the heavy overcast of the previous evening had thinned enough that weak sunlight filtered through. Families in Timber Ridge went about their morning routines. Men split firewood, women prepared breakfast, children did morning chores. The day seemed like it would be unremarkable, just another December morning in Montana Territory. Henrik woke at his usual time, shortly after dawn. He opened one of his window shutters and looked out at the gray morning. The air was still, which he found noteworthy. Complete stillness often preceded high winds. He lit his masonry stove with kindling and small pieces of wood, allowing it to warm gradually. The interior temperature had dropped to 48 degrees overnight, comfortable enough that he had slept well under 2 wool blankets. Within an hour of lighting the stove, the temperature would climb back to 55 or 60 degrees. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the first change became apparent. The temperature began dropping rapidly. Henrik noticed it when he opened his door briefly to observe conditions outside. The thermometer mounted near his entrance read 19 degrees. 30 minutes later, when he checked again, it read 14 degrees. Another 30 minutes brought it to 8 degrees. The rate of temperature decline was extraordinary, more than 15 degrees in 90 minutes. The wind arrived at approximately 11 o'clock. It came suddenly, without the gradual increase typical of normal weather patterns. One moment the air was still. The next moment, wind was howling through the valley with force that made trees bend and created a roaring sound audible even inside Henrik's thick-walled structure. The temperature continued falling. By noon, it had reached -2 degrees, and the wind was strong enough to create drifts from the thin layer of existing snow. The actual blizzard began just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Snow started falling, not the gentle flakes of a normal snowfall, but hard, wind-driven particles that flew horizontally. Visibility dropped to near zero within minutes. The combination of falling snow and wind-blown surface snow created a complete whiteout. Anyone more than 50 feet from their cabin would be unable to see their destination. The temperature continued its relentless decline. By 2 o'clock, Henrik's exterior thermometer read -12 degrees. William Peterson had been outside when the blizzard intensified. He had gone to his woodpile, approximately 30 feet from his cabin, to bring in additional firewood. The sudden whiteout conditions disoriented him. He could not see his cabin. He could not determine direction. He stood in the wind-driven snow, trying to orient himself, beginning to panic. Then his boot struck the woodpile he had been walking away from. He realized he had turned around completely. He grabbed an armload of wood and moved in what he hoped was the correct direction, taking small steps, probing with each foot. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably less than 2 minutes, His hand touched the log wall of his cabin. He followed the wall to his door and stumbled inside, gasping and covered in snow. Margaret Peterson saw the terror in her husband's face and understood immediately that this was not a normal storm. William dropped the firewood and went to their window. He could see nothing outside except white chaos. The wind was hitting their cabin with force that made the walls creak. He told Margaret to gather anything they might need and keep it close. He checked their food supplies. They had perhaps 3 weeks of basic provisions. He looked at his woodpile through the window, barely visible as a dark shape in the whiteout. He estimated he had 2 cords remaining, enough for perhaps 3 weeks of normal use. But if this storm continued, if the cold was as severe as it seemed, they might burn through wood much faster. Throughout Timber Ridge, similar realizations were occurring. Families were discovering that conditions outside had become deadly with shocking speed. The Miller family, living near the center of town, found that their cabin door had frozen shut, ice having formed in the gap between door and frame during the rapid temperature drop. Thomas Miller had to use an axe to chip away ice before he could get the door open. The Sherman family discovered that their chimney was not drawing properly in the high wind, causing smoke to back up into their cabin. They had to choose between breathing smoke or letting their fire go out. Henrik experienced none of these difficulties. His structure was designed for exactly these conditions. The thick walls eliminated drafts completely. The temperature inside remained steady at 56 degrees with only a small fire in his masonry stove. His door sealed perfectly, the steel construction and weather stripping creating an airtight barrier. His chimney drew efficiently regardless of wind conditions, the narrow flue and careful design ensuring smoke vented properly. He sat at his table, ate a lunch of bread and bacon, and read from a book about Roman architecture. Outside, the temperature reached -18 degrees, and the wind exceeded 50 miles per hour. The morning of December 9th, he went to his window and tried to see the exterior thermometer he kept mounted near the door. The glass was covered with frost on the inside, a thick layer of ice crystals that indicated severe cold outside. He scraped away enough frost to see through. The exterior thermometer read -35 degrees. He stared at it, certain he was misreading the markings. But no, the mercury column was clearly far below zero, lower than he had ever seen in 5 years of Montana winters. With the wind still howling, the wind chill would be approaching -60 degrees. Margaret Peterson wrapped herself in every piece of cloth and clothing she could find. She wore 2 dresses, a heavy coat, 2 scarves, and mittens. She was still cold. Their 2 children, Thomas Jr., age 7, and Elizabeth, age 5, huddled together under blankets near the stove. Margaret looked at her husband and saw fear in his eyes. He told her they needed to conserve wood. If this cold continued, their supply would not last. They would need to let the cabin get colder and use blankets and body heat for warmth rather than burning through their wood supply. Throughout Timber Ridge, families faced the same impossible choice. Burn wood to stay warm now and risk running out before the storm ended, or conserve wood and endure cold that could kill as surely as having no fuel at all. The calculations were grim. Most families had prepared for normal winter conditions, where cabin temperatures could be maintained around 50 or 60 degrees with moderate wood consumption. But when exterior temperatures dropped below -30 degrees and wind was removing heat as fast as it could be generated, maintaining even 40 degrees interior temperature required burning wood at 3 times the normal rate. The Miller family, living in a cabin that was slightly older and less well chinked than the Petersons' home, faced even worse conditions. Edward Miller woke to find ice forming on the interior walls of his cabin. Moisture from breathing and cooking had condensed and frozen on the cold logs. The temperature inside was 28 degrees despite a roaring fire. His wife Sarah was coughing, a deep, rattling sound that indicated the cold was affecting her lungs. Their teenage son Jacob was complaining that he could not feel his feet. Edward added more wood to their fire, knowing he was burning through his supply at an unsustainable rate, but unable to let his family freeze. The Sherman family discovered that their chimney problem from the previous day had worsened. Ice had formed in the chimney during the night, partially blocking the flue. When they tried to start their morning fire, smoke filled the cabin immediately. Martin Sherman had to choose between suffocating in smoke or trying to go outside to clear the chimney. Going outside in these conditions could be fatal. He opened the door, intending to reach the exterior chimney base. The wind hit him with physical force, and the cold seared his lungs. He managed 3 steps from the door before retreating. The chimney would remain blocked. Henrik Oswald woke comfortably warm in his stone structure. The interior temperature had dropped overnight to 52 degrees, but this was perfectly comfortable under blankets. He rose, performed his morning routine, and lit his stove with a small quantity of kindling. The masonry stove did not require constant feeding like the iron stoves in the town's cabins. One moderate firing would keep the space comfortable for most of the day. He used approximately 1/8 the wood his neighbors were burning through. He opened one of his interior window shutters and looked out through the narrow slit. The view was limited, but he could see enough to understand the situation. Snow had drifted against one side of his structure, reaching nearly to the top of his walls. The wind was visible as horizontal streams of snow moving at tremendous speed. The sky was white. The ground was white. Everything was white except for occasional dark shapes that might have been trees or buildings. He could not see the Peterson cabin 200 yards away. He could not see anything beyond perhaps 50 feet. Henrik closed the shutter and returned to his routine. He prepared breakfast, a simple meal of fried bacon, bread, and coffee. He ate slowly, reading while he ate, completely comfortable and safe. He understood intellectually that people in the town were suffering, but there was nothing he could do for them in these conditions. Going outside would be suicide. He could only wait for the storm to pass and hope his neighbors had prepared adequately. The 3rd day of the blizzard, December 20th, turned the storm into a survival emergency. The temperature remained at -33 degrees Fahrenheit, and the snow accumulation threatened the structural integrity of buildings throughout Timber Ridge. The wind had created drifts reaching 8, 10, and even 12 feet. Some roofs, bearing heavy snow weighing around 30 pounds per cubic foot, were under immense pressure. At approximately 10 o'clock, the first structural failure occurred at the Miller cabin. Edward Miller had been awake all night, hearing his roof creak under the increasing weight. When the roof collapsed, it came down suddenly, bringing tons of snow with it. Edward's family scrambled for safety, but the roof fell swiftly, trapping Edward under a beam. Inside the collapsed cabin, Edward was pinned, unable to move. Sarah Miller, with only one arm free, began digging through snow and debris, desperate to free her family. The Petersons, too, feared their cabin might collapse. William Peterson could hear the roof creaking and sagging under the weight. Meanwhile, Henrik's structure remained unaffected. The masonry dome absorbed the snow's weight, and Henrik spent the morning maintaining his routine, unaware of the life or death struggle just a quarter-mile away. On December 21st, the blizzard continued with relentless intensity. The temperature rose slightly to -28 degrees, but families' situations became critical. The Thompson family had been without fire for over 24 hours, experiencing the early stages of hypothermia. The Miller family remained trapped under their collapsed roof. William Peterson knew they had little wood left, stored in a woodpile buried under 6 feet of snow. To retrieve it, he had no choice but to brave the storm. After dressing in multiple layers of clothing, he tied a rope around his waist, hoping it would guide him back if he became disoriented. Outside, the wind nearly knocked him down. His face hurt from the cold, and he could barely see. Digging through the snow, he reached the woodpile, grabbed what he could, and began his slow, exhausting trek back to his cabin. The rope was his only lifeline. After 20 minutes of struggle, he reached the door, nearly frozen. Margaret rushed to help him, stripping off his frozen clothing. He had brought enough wood for perhaps 2 more days, buying them a little more time. Throughout Timber Ridge, similar desperate measures were being taken, with families fighting against the elements and dwindling resources. December 22nd, the 5th day of the blizzard, brought a subtle change. The wind lessened slightly, and visibility improved to around 100 feet. The temperature remained at -26 degrees, but the reduced wind made the conditions more bearable. Henrik immediately noticed the change and decided to check on his neighbors. He dressed warmly, preparing a rope system with iron stakes for safety. He loaded a pack with food, medical supplies, and a shovel, ready for any situation. Stepping outside, the cold hit him hard, but he could see now and move with more certainty. Henrik's first stop was the Peterson cabin. There he found William, gaunt and frostbitten, but alive. William, desperate, asked if Henrik could spare any wood. Henrik instructed him to gather his family. They would be coming to his shelter. Henrik assisted the Petersons, helping Margaret, who could barely walk, and the children, who were cold and crying. The group moved slowly along Henrik's rope line, making the slow, arduous journey back to his structure. Over the next few hours, Henrik rescued more families, the Thompsons, the Garretts, and finally, the Millers, who were trapped and injured. By late afternoon, 23 people were safely inside Henrik's structure. The refuge had transformed from a solitary home to a lifeline for those in need. Henrik's structure, originally designed for solitary occupation, became a cramped but functional shelter for 23 people. Henrik moved through the crowded space, organizing, directing, and ensuring everyone had what they needed. The masonry stove, which had once easily heated the space for just him, now worked harder to maintain a temperature of around 50 degrees, far warmer than any of the other cabins outside. Sleeping arrangements required creativity. Henrik assigned sections for different families, with the Petersons along the east wall and the Millers on the platform he had built for himself. The Thompsons settled near the stove for warmth, and other families arranged themselves in the remaining spaces. Blankets and coats provided some semblance of privacy. Food distribution became Henrik's first priority. He had supplies sufficient for 1 person for 6 months, which translated roughly to enough for 23 people for about 8 days. Henrik set up a simple ration system, 2 meals a day, 1 in mid-morning and 1 in the evening. Children received diluted condensed milk. Henrik prepared a simple but hearty meal of stew and bread, which brought tears to some as they experienced the comfort of a warm meal after days of hunger. He also attended to the injured, including treating frostbite and broken ribs. The storm outside continued, but inside, the shelter offered a moment of reprieve. The storm broke on the morning of December 23rd, the 6th day. The wind died down, and weak sunlight filtered through the thinning clouds. Although the temperature remained at -15 degrees, the conditions were no longer immediately life-threatening. Henrik opened his vault door and stepped outside to assess the damage to Timber Ridge. The landscape had been transformed into an alien world of white, with snowdrifts reaching up to 15 feet in some places. Buildings were buried, some entirely, while others stood as irregular mounds in the snow. Henrik organized a reconnaissance group of able-bodied men. They needed to determine which cabins had survived, which had collapsed, and if anyone was still trapped. William Peterson, despite his frostbitten fingers, insisted on joining. The group found 3 cabins completely destroyed, including the Miller cabin. 2 others had significant damage, rendering them uninhabitable. The most tragic discovery came at the Henderson homestead, where the entire family had been buried in the collapse of their cabin. The rescue team recovered their frozen bodies, but a proper burial would have to wait for a thaw. At the Patterson homestead, Daniel Patterson was found alive but severely frostbitten. He was carried back to Henrik's shelter for care. The toll on Timber Ridge was devastating, but Henrik's shelter had spared many. By spring of 1892, snowmelt continued into May, and Timber Ridge began its recovery. 7 families required new cabins or major repairs. Construction started, but this time it looked different. Henrik Oswald, now an unofficial consultant, visited building sites, advising on thicker walls, better insulation, and stronger roofs. His methods, once mocked, were now embraced. By the summer of 1892, 3 families had begun building stone structures based on Henrik's design. They were not identical to his, but they followed his principles: reinforced corners, thick walls, insulated cavities, and strong roofs capable of supporting heavy snow loads. The construction took longer and cost more, but it was considered a worthwhile investment for long-term survival. William and Margaret Peterson built a stone cabin with Henrik's help. Margaret, having lost 3 toes to frostbite, would never walk easily again. But she was alive, and her family had survived due to Henrik's foresight. In 1893, Henrik was paid to advise on the town hall and general store, and his methods were incorporated into the building. By 1895, Henrik's construction methods had spread throughout southwestern Montana Territory. The term Oswald-style cabin was used widely, and settlers who had once mocked Henrik now recognized the wisdom of his approach. His legacy endured, not just in buildings, but in the lives saved by his preparation.